John and I are at a little law firm here in Washington, D.C. John does a lot more litigation than I do. I do advocacy at the FCC and before Congress, but we've both been around long enough to kind of know some of the pitfalls and some of the puts and takes of hiring a lawyer and when you ought to do it and how you ought to deal with them. But the real point of this is basically to give you our names. That is, you guys should all feel free to get in touch with either me or John if you have any questions. We're happy to help. Dad, who built the prosthetic things for climbing on the roof? That was Travis, right?
Yes.
Travis called me and wanted to know if he could export those to
Yes.
to amputees kind of around the world, and I didn't know the answer, but I could find somebody who does medical export work. So we can kind of help that. I do have to say, this doesn't mean that we are available for unlimited legal advice. So what I want you to know is that you do have some when you have questions, you have somebody to talk to. So one thing that you might need a lawyer for is when you yourselves are fight with the VA about obtaining benefits, right? There are lots of folks who will help you when you are appealing a denial of benefits, but my experience involves representing folks at the Court of Veterans Appeals once their case was already screwed up, is that the best time to get some help is as you're filling out the paperwork. One of the kind of unsung things that we do, particularly in my kind of practice, is help people file paperwork with the government. And if you can kind of get that right, you avoid having, the kind of problems that you have to resolve at the Court of Appeals. We had one guy who ultimately, had to fight for years and ultimately passed away before he could get his benefits because they sent something to the wrong address or had the wrong address somewhere, just filled out the envelope wrong. We had another guy who we helped out where if you don't mind me telling my one war story, the question was they did some tests on his lungs and to find cancer. And the first test, they didn't get it. The second test, they didn't get it. The third test, they got it, and it had to do with so the question was, it had to do with, I believe it was Agent Orange benefits. What was the day he can say he got sick to start the time for his benefits? So the government took the position that the day he could say he got sick was the day after the third test. And I said, well, that can't be right because he was clearly sick before that test, right? At some point, and we had a doctor say most likely what happened was the first two tests just missed the mass, right? Like the needle went in the wrong place. And I said, well, why don't we just split the difference? We'll go in between the last test and the first test. And the government said, absolutely not. We refused to do this. And ultimately we won the case and won lawyers' fees, which nobody ever gets from the government. But it was a problem that just could have been fixed if a little bit more work had been done on the beginning side rather than the last side. So again, it's just a simple thing, and that's something that you might not think of. A lot of the folks here are going to be setting up companies, right? That's the whole point of this group, right? And what I want to say, just a couple of things that I've got no problem with things like Zoom Legal or whatever the kind of the things that you can find on the internet. And if you are doing your own company with only you, that is a perfectly kind of fine way to save some money initially, right? But once you kind of have other people, particularly other non-veterans, and you're going to want to talk to a lawyer about how you want to set it up, right? Like, if your partner is a husband and wife team, what happens if they get divorced, right? How can you get out of it? If we helped somebody who was part of a partnership that ran a fancy gym, and ultimately kind of the two partners and my client disagreed about, well, they disagreed about everything under the sun, whether, you know, the sky was blue, they disagreed, whether, you know, Monday ends with a Y, they disagreed. And the agreement was a little bit of a mess. It was done by somebody, I don't know who did it, but the agreement didn't make really clear what happens when you get out of it. And of course, the other side thought that what happens would cost my client a bunch of money, and my client thought what would happen would cost the other guys a bunch of money. And my only point is that whenever you're doing something with more than one person, excuse me, you want to try and think about that stuff beforehand, because the time to solve that problem is before you start fighting with your partners. And the only other thing I would mention is, you know, the first thing you learn in law school, or one of the first things you learn, is that the corporate formalities matter, which means that if you've got a company, you should be keeping the accounting separate for that company. It should have a separate checks for that company. You shouldn't be kind of commingling your money with their money. The idea is that the whole reason you set up a company in the first place is that if something goes wrong, somebody has to sue the company and not you personally, right? But if you are messing around and you are acting as if the company isn't really a separate thing, then they could try to go after you. So a lot of vets want to set up a business, in part because they can get benefits from the government that'll give them a leg up on the competition. So you're a service disabled business, and you've got a construction company, and that means that you've got certain priorities and benefits in terms of bidding on jobs, right? And so the one thing is that you want somebody who knows or can figure out the rules about when you qualify, right? You don't want to kind of just search on the internet to figure out if you qualify, or assume that you qualify because you have, you know, a real, you know, service related disability. You want somebody to kind of get that right. But the thing I want, and if you take away kind of anything from this, you know, this is my dad's old, you know, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And it's not really legal advice. You know, we've certainly encountered a bunch of things where, you know, somebody's cousin or brother or buddy wants to use a vet in order to take advantage of their service disabled status in order to get benefits, right? You know, so I want to start my own construction company. I'm going to use one of you as my partner in order to get these benefits. Fraud is a real concern, and I think John could shake his head up and down if he, you know, if somebody's got a real clever way to kind of run their own business through you, and they tell you that it's, you know, it's absolutely legal, you know, that ought to set off alarms for you. And if something sets off alarms for you, you know, you ought to talk to somebody independent who can help you figure that out. But I think there is, look, I teach law to undergrads at GW, and all my undergrads kind of think that they need to learn a legal style of writing that's really complicated and really, you know, awful. And they think that if you have some sort of long contract, ideally in a really teeny font, then that'll really protect you, you know. And that's just sort of not the way things work in real life, and it's not the way things work, you know, in the kind of business. You know, a contract is meant to sort of, it is meant to, you know, specify an actual deal, right? And it's meant to reflect kind of what you think the deal is. And so, you know, the one thing is that your lawyer ought to be able to explain in plain English kind of what the contract is and what the deal is, right? And then the lawyer can kind of help anticipate disputes. Just the same kind of thing as we were talking before about, you know, when you're setting up a partnership, what happens if your partner is divorced, right? Well, you know, part of the contract ought to help anticipate those kind of disputes and fill them out. And again, look, I do some work for a public media organization that just went through a bunch, and I'll tell you about a little bit more about the litigation. But it was one of those things where there, you know, most of the contracts will tell you, for example, if there's a lawsuit, it has to be in a certain place. You know, this is what happens if the parties disagree. And the lawyer, the inside lawyer, had all that language in the contract, but the president thought it was just a bunch of BS and didn't want to scare the other side, so he took it all out. So of course, when we actually had a dispute, the contract didn't say any of these things. And it just meant that they had to spend more money on us fighting with the other lawyers about these kind of things that ought to be in the contract. But look, I will say this again, and this is Bob Nilsson speaking, instead of Mike Nilsson. If you don't trust the counterparty, then the contract's not going to help you. That is, there's no contract in the world written, if Oliver Wendell Holmes comes down from heaven and writes you a contract where the other side is untrustworthy, the contract, is not going to, in and of itself, put you in a good position. And if you don't trust the counterparty, then you should not do business with them. If you could.